Hello and welcome to this latest video where we investigate nursery rhymes and lullabies. They seem to be full of fluffy language and childhood innocence, but is there more to them than meets the eye? Yes, there is, otherwise this would be, a pretty pointless video. So yes, there is more to them than meets the eye. There is a darkness within them. They cover some of the most bleak moments in British history. They cover subjects such as religious intolerance and torture and murder and disease and death. And it's no wonder really when you think about it, the babies don't sleep through the night. So join me as I reveal the shocking truth behind nursery rhymes. Let's take a favourite of many parents when it comes to babies' nap time. As an example, it goes like this. I can see you dropping off already, but what do you suppose that is all about? If truth be told, no one knows for sure, and I acknowledge there are several theories about this one, including claims that this was the first poem ever written on American soil. But those words are undoubtedly questionable, and they beg a lot of questions. What is baby doing on a treetop? How did it get there? What happens when it falls? Well, one rather chilling theory is that this innocent lullaby is a song about infant mortality. There was a custom in some parts of rural England that if a newborn baby was to die, the mother would place it in a basket hung from the branch of a tree, presumably in the hope that the sunlight and fresh air might revive it. Oh, it's just got a bit dark, isn't it? It's about to get worse because there is another theory, and in this particular theory, we are once again dealing with the death of a baby. In this case, it's murder. This theory suggests that this famous lullaby started out as a satirical sectarian folk song about a Protestant conspiracy. When James II became king, religious tensions in Britain still ran high. It was no secret that the king was a Roman Catholic, and most people of influence in the English court and parliament at the time were Protestants, so that was never going to be a comfortable relationship. Things started to boil over, though, when James tried to pass a decree which made his Catholicism not just something to be tolerated, but something which was enshrined in law. Then, when his son was born, he declared that he would be raised a Roman Catholic. People began to become fearful that this would be the start of a new Catholic royal dynasty and a return to religious reprisals, and it all kicked off. There was a conspiracy theory perpetuated by the Protestant side that the baby James II had called his own son was in fact an impostor. The story goes that the child the Queen had really given birth to was a second daughter. But an impostor baby, a baby boy, the fruit of the King of France's overactive loins no less, had been switched with her. This impostor baby had supposedly arrived in England under the guard of a cohort of French soldiers on the night the Queen went into labour. This baby was wrapped in a shawl and was carried up a tree outside the Queen's bedroom by its guard. It would pass through the open window, and the King's true heir, the little girl, was handed back in this dastardly swap. The Queen then emerged from her room with the healthy baby boy, which was secretly the child of the King of France, but she would declare it as her own newborn baby. Meanwhile, the true heir to the English kingdom was taken into the woods and unceremoniously slaughtered and buried in a shallow grave by the heathen French. The people who heard this story were absolutely incensed. It pressed all of the hot buttons of people who feared that there might be a Catholic revival. The baby was not legitimate, that the king had tried to deceive the people, that the deception involved the killing of the true heir to the throne with the replacement of a baby who was foreign, was Catholic, and was French. I mean, it just pressed every single hot button that would really, really irritate these people. So when this nursery rhyme came into existence, this wasn't designed to be something to soothe children and help them fall asleep. This was propaganda. This was a way of keeping a story alive and making it easy to recall by condensing it down to these simple stanzas and for people to sing it to one another so it would spread like wildfire. And of course, it did. There's also some rich use of symbolism here, which makes this theory a very plausible one. The cradle is a metaphor for the royal house of Stuart, and the wind is either the purifying tide of Protestantism or possibly a reference to the force of William of Orange's army coming to Britain to fight. The bough breaking is when the plot to create a Catholic dynasty fails and the revolution deposes the king. At the bottom of the first printed version of this nursery rhyme, there is a footnote which reads, "This may serve as a warning to the proud and ambitious, who climb so high that they generally fall at last," which pretty much confirms that the song has political overtones. So, if that's now made you think, well, I'm not singing that again, I wonder what alternatives you might try. Goosey Goosey Gander, maybe. If you're not familiar with it, it goes like this. This rhyme was popularised in the early 20th century by the children's story writer Beatrix Potter. That last line is a dead giveaway that all is not well in this story, and once again it's a rather brutal Protestant sectarian song. The rhyme is generally accepted as an account of a raid by soldiers on a Catholic household in the Puritan-fuelled purge that came after the English Civil War had been won by the parliamentarians. Catholicism was outlawed in 1559, so anyone wishing to participate in a Catholic Mass had to do it in secret, otherwise they would be executed as a heretic, so priests had to be protected by the families who wanted their services. To keep them safe, Catholic households used to have architects create secret passageways and rooms known as priest holes, which had their access points disguised in the most ingenious ways. At the first sign of trouble, the priest and any religious artefacts associated with Catholicism would have been unceremoniously bundled into the priest hole to hide until the danger had passed. In this song, the soldiers begin by interrogating the householders. When they ask, "Whither shall I wander?" they are inquiring whereabouts in the house the priest hole is hidden. They then search the whole house, even in the private chambers of the lady of the house, a place that men other than her husband would have been prohibited from entering. So the fact that these soldiers were so disrespectful of a lady's honour that they would just go in there anyway would have seemed very shocking to people who would have heard this song at the time. However, there is a double sting to this one, as that is the room where the priest hole is hidden, which throws all sorts of overtones as to why the priest was in there. Again, this is not intended for children. Meeting an old man who wouldn't say his prayers is a reference to discovering a priest who had been hidden away, who did not carry with him the Book of Common Prayer, which was the Protestant blueprint for worship. Being grabbed by the leg and thrown down the stairs sadly is just the beginning of the rough treatment and torture these poor souls would have endured if captured. This was a very violent period in history, and ordinary people would have been fed a steady stream of inflammatory propaganda of how dangerous Catholics were to life in England, in the same way Americans were told that communists were terrifying demons during the McCarthy era. Captured Catholic priests would have been tortured to reveal the identity of all the families they would have given the sacrament to. This would have featured things like having all their fingernails pulled out, branding with hot irons, eye gouging, and the application of the thumb screw, which crushes the bones in the wearer's thumb. Once the torturer had extracted all the information he thought he could, and assuming his subject had not died of the pain, they were then executed. For balance, it is worth pointing out that during the reign of Bloody Mary, Protestant worshippers were given similar treatment by the then ruling Catholics. There were no goodies and baddies in this struggle. Each side committed the most horrific atrocities on their fellow countrymen in the name of religion. But once again, it's those supposedly innocent, childish nursery rhymes and lullabies that capture the story. This is a rhyme written by Protestants about Catholic subjugation in the reign of Queen Mary, hence the Mary Mary bit. The garden is the kingdom of England. Silver bells and cockle shells are euphemism for instruments of torture used to force people to convert. As for the pretty maids all in a row, there was an instrument similar to a guillotine that was used for beheading heretics called a maiden. The suggestion that these were lined up in a row was intended to give a sense of scale as to how many people were executed for their faith. Religious differences can be so controversial, so let's move away from that area of subject matter. How about a nursery rhyme that's all about an egg? Surely they can't have dark origins there? Well, if you're talking about Humpty Dumpty, I hate to be the one to break it to you, but it has nothing to do with eggs. The only reason people think this nursery rhyme is about an egg is because of a very famous illustrated children's story and songbook from the 19th century. In it, the illustrator depicted Humpty as an egg. They did so without any integrity. Humpty Dumpty was a killing machine, the absolute pinnacle of military engineering of its day. This was during the English Civil War, which raged from 1642 to 1651 between the Cavaliers, who were loyal to the king, and the Roundheads, who were republicans revolting to overthrow the monarchy in Britain. The Cavaliers had commissioned a huge siege cannon that supposedly combined the mobility of a small cannon with the firepower of a big one. It was not particularly portable, as it was so vast and made out of iron. However, if you had enough horses and men, you could transport it to where it was needed. Mount it onto a stone wall, as anything less substantial than that would have been destroyed by its recoil, and rain hell upon your enemy with the firepower of a fixed cannon. During a siege, when you were held inside a walled town or a castle, you never knew where your enemy might attack from, so fixed cannons, though powerful, could be outflanked by a smart enemy. With this thing, though, they had firepower wherever they needed it. As is often the case with big guns, the army had a jokey nickname for it, and in this case it was Humpty Dumpty. I have to confess I don't know why. During the siege of Colchester in 1648, Humpty was hauled with some difficulty onto the top of the church tower of St. Mary on the Walls. Once they managed to get it up there, it proved to be phenomenally successful, and for 11 weeks it thundered down on the attacking Roundheads, blowing up everything in its range, killing hundreds of men. The Roundheads knew that the only way they were going to subdue their enemy was if they took out this monstrous weapon. But on the battlefield, they had nothing that could match it for range or firepower. Eventually, they managed to explode charges in the walls of the church tower itself, which sufficiently weakened the structure to make it incapable of supporting this vast weapon. It broke free of the masonry that had been supporting it and tumbled over the town walls and landed barrel down in a marsh. Now, because of its tremendous weight, it sunk into the ground, embedding itself to such a point that no matter how many men and horses were deployed to retrieve it, they could not pull it free. And that is how Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall, and why all the king's horses and king's men could not put him together again. So poor baby now has so many of her favourite lullabies maligned. What else can we sing to her to sleep with? How about Ring a Ring a Rosies? Surely that can't be anything morbid about that one. Yeah. Beautiful, isn't it? Unfortunately, it's about one of the single darkest episodes in human history. The Black Death, better known as the bubonic plague, which swept throughout Europe, the Middle East and North Africa on more than one occasion in the medieval period. To put some kind of context into the sort of numbers of people who were affected by this, it's believed that anything from 350 to 375 million people were wiped out by the Black Death in Europe alone. And bear in mind, populations were a lot lower in those days than they are now. That could be anything up to 60% of the entire population of Europe. And to add insult to injury, the bubonic plague came on the back of 2 years of intense famine, which had wiped out millions more. So it wasn't a particularly happy time generally. What we have here, with the words of this particular nursery rhyme, commemorate the event of the plague. But what's quite cool is you can tell from the language that's used that this originated from London, because a lot of London slang is used. So, for example, when you have the words a ring a rosies, that's a very London-centric way of describing the ring of red, bright red, what are known as buboils, the boils that are symptomatic of bubonic plague. The pocketful of posies is the painfully inadequate remedy that people hoped might be effective at fighting the infection. A corsage or poultice of dried herbs and flowers was carried around in people's pockets in the belief that it might bestow some protection on the carrier. A tissue is just an onomatopoeic description of a sneeze, as cold-like symptoms were usually the precursor to full-blown plague. As for we all fall down, well, that's pretty much what happened to 350 million people, falling down dead. And so it goes on. Bar Black Sheep is all about people starving because of the crippling taxation placed on wool in the 13th century. Pop Goes the Weasel is all about Londoners dying in poverty because of the spiralling cost of food versus the stagnation of wages during the Industrial Revolution. I have a favourite though. This one is dark, and it has its origins in religious conflict, which I said I was going to move away from. But I think it's worth being the exception to the rule. Have you ever heard of Little Jack Horner? Well, he was a real person, and here is his rhyme. Going back to the Reformation again, in 1539, one of Henry VIII's edicts to distance himself from Rome was called the Dissolution of Monasteries. In effect, he closed down all the monasteries in England, Wales and Ireland and took their land and money for himself. Many senior abbots and monks were imprisoned or executed, and they had all their assets confiscated. One such senior cleric, who wanted to avoid the chop, was Richard Whiting, the last abbot of Glastonbury. He had grown very rich and decided that his best bet to avoid losing everything, including his life, was to try and bribe Henry VIII. Rather creatively, he hid the title deeds of some of his great houses and estates in a Christmas pie and ordered his steward, a man called Jack Horner, to deliver it to the king. His logic being that when the king cut into the pie and found all these title deeds to all these valuable properties worth millions in modern money, he would say, "What a jolly old abbot this man is. Do you know what? I'm going to let him off." Now, Jack Horner was clearly a bit wily. Even though he was described as little in the nursery rhyme, that is not because he was a small boy. It means that he was not a big man in the sense of being important, aristocratic or rich. He was clearly not going to let that stand in the way of his ambition, though. During the trip to London, he is said to have stuck his thumb into the pie, found the title deeds to the manor at Mells, the plum of the crop, as it was by far the biggest and most prestigious of all the properties. He then delivered the now somewhat depleted pie to the king and took ownership of the manor house for himself. Henry gladly took ownership of all the other properties, but nonetheless, the abbot Richard Whiting was arrested and executed. Now, for legal reasons, I should point out that this story is hotly denied by the descendants of Jack Horner, who apparently still live in that manor house to this day. I wonder if anyone's ever been sued for going, "Oh, Jimmy Hill." I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, please feel free to share it on social media, and please subscribe to this channel. You will find videos on history and folklore and legends, usually on the dark side if I'm absolutely honest, hopefully told with a sort of tongue-in-cheek entertainment value all of its own. So look, until the next time we meet, please enjoy your history.